Why do you think that the sense-making crisis is central, or how would you frame it initially?
Well, technology has become the sense-making instrument for 3 billion people, and I think that's never been more true in a coronavirus era. Because with many of us stuck at home, we are peering through the glasses, the telescope of social media out there to understand what's happening in the world. Because we're not walking around in the world as much. There's fewer journalists out there. We have ironically, due to social media's privatization of the attention sphere, it actually hollowed out journalistic organizations. So there's fewer journalists actually going out there because it's less profitable to run local news organizations. So we are really left to, these set of platforms to make sense of what's going on in the world. And it's become the primary sense-making vehicle. I mean, in my first, to introduce your viewers or listeners to some of my work initially, when I was at Google as a design ethicist, had made this presentation back in 2013 saying, never before in history have essentially 50 designers at 3 tech companies determined what 2 billion people's attention is going to be on a daily basis. And that we, as those technology designers, have a moral responsibility in holding the kind of collective consciousness carefully, because we don't have a choice. I mean, we can't not hold it. We can't just take our hand off the steering wheel and just let chaos rule. I mean, we are shaping 3 billion people's attention on a daily basis. So the question is, what do we do with that responsibility? And when you use algorithms, automated programs, automated rules, like whatever gets the most clicks should go to the top of people's feeds, whatever gets the most likes or shares, those are 3 different ways to rank a news feed, but they are imprecise in what they're selecting for. And they tend to select, as everybody now knows, I think, for the kind of outrage or extreme, attention-grabbing things, which do not correlate with the kinds of different editorial rules or algorithms that you, as someone who was in journalism before doing this podcast, would choose to rank what's going to happen in this interview. I mean, when you proceed in this interview right now with me, you're not going to be sorting by what question could I ask you next that will cause the most attention to continue. And there are actors who can win that way, and games theoretically, if they outcompete the other actors, that's what causes this kind of what we call the race to the bottom of the brainstem for attention. That if actors are just acting on the basis for what gets the most attention, whether that's a journalist or Trump, who does operate this way, or technology platforms, you end up with a very different kind of collective consciousness and collective psyche than if you're actually making grounded, editorial, thoughtful, values-based decisions. And we tend to not be very articulate about what values we would choose to curate what should go into our attentional lives, both individually, in that we let lots of things rush into our psyche the moment we wake up in the morning, and you look at your phone within the first 2 minutes of getting up, and collectively.
Yeah, in the first film in this series, I put out a quote from Jonathan Haidt where he talked about that I think he dated it back to about 2013, 2014, that effectively what we have been doing is the equivalent of doubling the gravitational constant. And I thought it was a beautiful analogy, because he said, imagine that you change the gravitational constant, all sorts of weird things would start happening. Planes would start falling out of the sky. You'd find it more difficult to walk, all of these sort of things. And he said, that's kind of what we've been doing with social media. And that really kind of frames, I think, why everything feels just more intense, that it's just raised the intensity of everything, that suddenly even our conversations are becoming performative. We've got this sort of sense of a hollowing out of the private sphere, and this sort of sense of being disconnected from what we actually really think, because we're now doing something because we think that's what other people will reward us for, or everything starts to become this kind of weird, hollowed out sort of sense. Do you find that a useful metaphor?
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt is a friend, and we've had many conversations about this. I think his metaphor is exactly spot on. We similarly use this metaphor of ergonomics, that there's kind of a, imagine the world before the field of ergonomics. You sit in a chair that's not ergonomic at all. And let's say we don't actually have a fine-grained understanding of the geometry of the human back or the lumbar, or, the right proportionality for what a chair should be for it to be comfortable for many hours a day. If you're only in that chair for, let's say, 10 minutes a day, you don't really need a field of ergonomics as crucially or essentially as if you're in that chair for, let's say, 12 hours a day. And essentially, we don't have a good self-understanding with technology of what are the ergonomics of a society? What are the folds? You can think of it, our co-founder for the Center for Humane Technology, Asa Raskin, has this metaphor of origami, that, origami has these kinds of pre-folds. And if you fold along the pre-folds, you get this beautiful picture, this beautiful, constructed object. If you don't fold on the pre-folds, you get something that's just kind of messy and doesn't really work. And I think that when it comes to human nature, there are pre-folds to our human needs and values and how we make sense of the world well. If you take our well-being, there are pre-folds in terms of about how much sleep we probably all should be getting. The fact that if you look at our pre-folds around the human eye and screens, we really shouldn't be looking at blue light late at night, because blue light tricks our melatonin system into thinking that we shouldn't go to bed, and then that can screw up some of the cancer cleanup processes in the human body. So the interesting thing here, so that's on the well-being side. On the sense-making side, there's pre-folds around trusting that if people around me are saying something is true, I tend to believe that that thing is true. Meaning we are very highly influenced by social influence and social proof. The more other people, or 10 of my friends, say that this is true, the more it really feels like it must be true. And those heuristics are useful from the savannah, because you would rely on the other people in your tribe to let you know, is there actually a tiger out there in the wilderness, and did they see it yesterday? And I should really trust those people. But social media is distorting all of those signals, all of those heuristics, all of those vulnerabilities of the human mind at every single level. And that's why I think Jonathan's metaphor of it's as if it's changing the gravitational constant or the other coefficients that make the universe sort of stand up and not collapse into itself. Social media has distorted all those things. I think that the way to see this is that the technology has become the new 21st century infrastructure, but is more intimately embedded into our minds and our nervous systems. The cars and the railroads were not embedded into my nervous system in the same direct way. And when the digital eats the physical, when the digital infrastructure eats the physical infrastructure, it takes over the basis from which we're making sense of the world, the way we're thinking, the way we're waking up in the morning, the way kids are developing, especially in a COVID era where kids are at home and they're actually using digital technology for many more hours per day, and they don't actually have school. So if we don't have a good understanding of what the fit is between technology sort of as like a brain implant into a society, then we're going to get that wrong. And if you're going to put a brain implant into a human being, you have FDA approval and a deep understanding for who's trained to put that brain implant into a human before you do such a critical operation that could scramble someone's brain. When you take social media and you tune the implant into a society, there's no FDA approval. We've never run this experiment before. And the people who are doing it are 20-something-year-old, tech engineers who went to computer science schools and rarely have a deep understanding of history or the humanities or, kind of Habermas, or the kinds of things that make a society work well.
And what would be the biggest sort of frame that you'd use? I know that our mutual friend Daniel Schmachtenberger has talked about that on a kind of finite playing field with exponential tech, what you end up with is sort of self-terminating dynamics. And I guess my focus as a journalist and having kind of moved into the alternative media space, I'm sort of seeing all of these failure conditions of the information space as being reflecting some dynamics that are common across many different systems. But I guess I'm seeing them more in the sort of sense of we're losing all sense of a shared reality. We're losing any sense of common purpose, which just seems like a fundamental problem. But I guess it's like the source code. We're seeing a sort of faulty source code being amplified by these sort of big tech platforms and the incentive structures pushing towards what certainly feel like self-terminating outcomes if we can't kind of get a grip on it.
Yeah, I think the simplest thing for people to get, which is kind of obvious, but it's important just to double underline, is that polarization is profitable because because these platforms make money from people's attention. I mean, how much money have you paid for your Facebook account in the last, few years? Zero. And yet, the stock price is north of $600 billion. And the reason for that isn't just that they quote unquote have your data, it's that they actually need your attention. And there's only so much. I think one of the things that we'll hopefully get to later in this conversation is, the attention economy is a finite playing field. It's a finite environment. It's a finite set of resources. And we're not going to grow the size of the attention economy. Although there has been some gains in the fact that once you get people multitasking and paying attention to two things at once, you've technically doubled the size of the extractable attention economy. But there is a finite carrying capacity. So much like with climate change, where I think what is the number? I think the average American is if everyone consumed like the average American, we would be 40 times over the Earth's carrying capacity in a year, something like that. So I think with the attention economy, we're actually far over our finite carrying capacity. And the win-lose game that's being played means that as it gets more and more competitive, if I don't get your attention, someone else is right there to get it, whether it's YouTube or another, YouTube influencer or, someone else. And that finite playing field means that if I don't do a good job of getting your attention, then obviously I'm going to lose it. So if I don't personalize your newsfeed, I'm going to be outcompeted by someone who does personalize your newsfeed. So this is really important because let's say you and I are actually brothers, and we have literally, we're brothers, we're in the same family, and we have the same friends and family. We have like very, very aligned. You would think that if you and I both log in a newsfeed, we would see almost the same set of things because we're friends with the same people approximately. But that's not how it works at all, because if I go into your newsfeed and you're a fan of cute, animals, and I'm a fan of deep thinking existential risk videos, we're going to see completely different news feeds, even though we actually have the same basis of quote unquote friends. That's an unprecedented situation. It's often the case that people who live in the same space have the same friends, have had that, but their attentional sense-making environments are totally different. So in other words, a Facebook newsfeed that is personalizing you with affirmation, not information, is going to outcompete a newsfeed that's giving you a broad spectrum of information, which means that things will cleave along the lines of partisan divides, and that's exactly what's happened. Zach Stein, another one of our friends in our community, and Daniel and Jordan's community, has sort of said this is almost like a social psychotic break, that we've actually kind of fractured the newsphere into, at least especially in kind of the West, a left kind of oriented sphere of information and a right sphere of information, which of course preceded social media in the form of Fox News or the Murdoch family of properties. But it's now gotten worse because now within that, to get attention within that sphere, I have to use outrage. So both sides, the left and the right, are using outrage to get people to get people's attention, and then that just further cleaves the kind of divides. And if you look at these graphs of polarization in the United States between, I think it's 2011 and 2018, between the left and the right, you just see it moving further and further apart. There could be an argument that that's just Fox News versus the MSNBCs of the world. But that social media is not involved. But I really don't think that's true. If you think about the number of times now that even television-based news is actually referring to social media as the basis for what they put on air, it's really important to see that social media has become central to the sense-making of everyone, including the media. And then the feedback loop, one last thing that there is between, in this case, Trump and Fox News, that he gets his own information from social media and from Fox, and then Fox, sort of cycles it back to him. So there's this sort of inmates are running the asylum kind of effect that has really driven the world insane.